Now we're going to discuss the works between 1760s to 1781, beginning with Tristram Shandy, or the alternate title, The Life and Times of Tristram Shandy, Gentleman. It was purported to be an autobiography at first, where the main character and protagonist, Tristram Shandy, narrates the accounts of his life, his adventures, and his misadventures. It is one of the first novels that ever used graphic devices, so it's considered one of our first graphic novels. Heavy use of double entendre here as well. It was a humorous novel written by Laurence Sterne in the 1760s. Songs of Innocence and Experience by William Blake is a collection of illustrated poems. Each poem is accompanied by an illustration, and the book was compiled as a collection to show the two contrary states of the human soul. William Blake wanted to illustrate, both graphically and literally, how the human soul is conflicted. He had a strong connection to his Christian faith, and so morality is absolutely part of the innocence that he speaks of. In showing the two contrary states of the human soul, his poems in the first part, Songs of Innocence, and his poems in the second part, Songs of Experience, have similar titles to show the conflicting states, or the two sides. For example, in Songs of Innocence, there is a poem called Infant Joy. In Songs of Experience, there is a matching poem, an alternate poem, called Infant Sorrow. This was written in 1789 and is a total of 19 poems with illustrations. The Rime of the Ancient Mariner is Samuel Taylor Coleridge's longest poem. It was a signal shift to modern poetry and the beginning of Romantic literature. This poem is part of his work with William Wordsworth as they co-authored the book Lyrical Ballads. Coleridge was an English romantic who also wrote Kubla Khan. The Rime of the Ancient Mariner is the story of a sailor who comes home and regales people at a wedding feast with the adventures that he had at sea. At first, the audience is amused, then interested, then aghast, then fearful, and finally satisfied. All of the tales that they have heard. It is considered one of Coleridge's best poems. Jane Eyre is a novel written by Charlotte Bronte. It is considered a Bildungsroman, which is a coming-of-age novel. It chronicles the life and growth of a woman, Jane Eyre, into adulthood and her love for Mr. Rochester. It's a very interesting novel because it is different from the Jane Austen novels that were predecessing the Bronte sisters in writing. This is actually ahead of its time because even though it did have a social critique like the Austen novels and a strong core of Christian morality, it was ahead of its time in that it diverted the idea of a novel of manners by addressing issues that were rather controversial, like female sexuality and feminism and critique of behavior. This novel was written in 1847. A Tale of Two Cities by Charles Dickens, written in 1859. It's a story about how the French peasants were demoralized by the French aristocracy in the years leading up to the French Revolution. It also details the brutality with which the peasants dealt with the aristocrats during the early years of the French Revolution. It also parallels the same time in London to show the similar circumstances were happening in London, though there was no actual revolution happening there. The Tale of Two Cities was a great example of antithesis to show the contrary states of what was happening in balance, things being very good and things being very bad. Through the Looking Glass was written in 1871. It was the sequel to Lewis Carroll's first book, Alice in Wonderland. It picks up 6 months after Alice leaves Wonderland. She returns to Wonderland and revisits her friends and meets new friends, for example, the Jabberwocky, and her old friends Tweedledee and Tweedledum. Lewis Carroll wrote this specifically as an affront to the realism trend that was emerging at the time, and he wanted to maintain his fantastical story of Alice, so he wrote The Looking Glass, where she re-enters Wonderland by entering the mirror. Remember that you have a brief summary of these stories here, but it is up to you to go and investigate much more detailed summaries so that you can reference characters and plot points. So try the study questions at the end to see what you have learned so far.